we'd like to begin this session of the conference. In his Questions on Law in the Summa Theologiae, Thomas Aquinas argues that the judicial precepts of the Mosaic Law, those which directed the children of Israel to live justly among themselves and towards persons of other nations, can provide policymakers with insights on establishing and promoting justice, even in very different times and places. While for the Gentiles there is no obligation to observe these precepts, one should not ignore all that can be learned from them, from their letter and especially from their spirit. Our speaker today, Professor Paul Sigmund, will address us on the current relevance of one of these Mosaic precepts, that establishing a Jubilee year every 50 years in which slaves were freed and debts forgiven. Jubilee 2000 is a movement to forgive the debts of poor countries whose weakest and most vulnerable members often suffer under a yoke of economic exploitation. Paul Sigmund is professor of politics at Princeton. While the field of political science undergoes increasing fragmentation and specialization.
Please. The morning sessions are about to begin.
Timing.
As soon as possible.
I wasn't patient enough.
The morning sessions are about to begin. Please proceed to your respective rooms as soon as possible. Thank you.
All right. Take two. Okay. Paul Sigmund is professor of politics at Princeton. While the field of politics undergoes increasing fragmentation and ultra-specialization, Professor Sigmund works in political theory and comparative politics, which is quite a feat, and he has distinguished himself in both fields. He helped to establish the Princeton Latin American program in 1967 and has been its director several times since. He has published over 200 articles and 18 books, including The United States and Democracy in Chile, Liberation Theology at the Crossroads, Democracy or Revolution, St. Thomas Aquinas on Ethics and Politics, Multinationals in Latin America, The Politics of Nationalization, and The Overthrow of Allende and the Politics of Chile. He has taught at the Catholic University of Santiago and the University of Chile, and has conducted research there almost every year since 1966. His most recent books are an edited volume on evangelization and religious freedom in Latin America, and Chile 1973 to 1998, The Coup and Its Consequences. And next year, the Norton Critical Edition series will publish his book on John Locke, which is a compendium of excerpts from the Letter on Toleration, the Second Treatise, and numerous other works of Locke. And again, that will come out in 2001. So today he will speak to us on Jubilee 2000, Debt Forgiveness, and Third World Poverty. Please join me in welcoming Professor Paul Sigmund.
Nice to be back in Notre Dame. Last time I was here was a year and a half ago, and I still owe the paper. In fact, I'm seeing Father Scully this afternoon about the draft paper, and which I promised to him that I would get to him by this summer, but somehow didn't quite work out. I hope this one won't take as long to get a final version. This is a very, very preliminary version. And one that is, I think, relates very much to our theme, because it's increasingly clear, especially in recent years, that the problem of debt and debt relief has a lot to do with poverty, death, lack of education, lack of health care in the third world. And not only in the third world. If you looked at the New York Times day before yesterday, there was an article about the decline of health and increasing mortality in Eastern Europe and the ex-Soviet Union and Russia. And it was interesting that in that article, one of the things they said is, that there now is a movement for debt relief, for debt forgiveness for the Eastern Europeans and Russia. And it is to cite the New York Times again, those of you who read the New York Times Sunday magazine carefully may have seen the interview with Bono, is that how he's pronounced, of U2, who has now decided he's going to devote his life to working on debt forgiveness. And he describes his meeting with Pope John Paul II, in which the Pope borrowed a pair of his sunglasses and put them on. They took a picture, but he said the picture will never be published for fear it'll be placed on T-shirts. So the Pope and sunglasses. But he also talked about the problem to Jesse Helms, whom he claims he had in tears with his descriptions of that takes doing, I guess, of children in Africa, and that he's got Pat Robertson lined up as well. So there is a kind of broad consensus and interest in this issue, and it's one that has been linked in a very interesting way. Seems to me to people who are religiously motivated and concerned about international social justice. And the specific link is this organization which theoretically is going out of business in a couple of months, Jubilee 2000. So I want to talk about sort of the interaction of that organization and the people involved in the debt forgiveness movement and the international system, the international financial system, and specifically focusing on the question of what is possible, what has been done, and a fair amount has been done, or a fair amount has been promised, put it that way, and I'll go through those promises. But there's a great deal of need for further pressure, including grassroots pressure. So this relates not only to questions of death, life and death, it also relates to the internationalization of social concern of the sort that the Pope mentioned. Well, Centésimo Años endorsed the market system, but said specifically on the question of relations of rich and poor countries, there had to be action on the by the international system, international action. And this, I think, is a kind of interesting case study of how that has happened. We all know that there are terrible problems of health problems, education problems, AIDS in Africa. 1/5 of the world population lives below the international poverty line of $1 a day, and a further quarter survive on between $1 and $2. In 1993, there were 13 doctors per 100,000 people in the third world, while they were in the first world, there were 244 doctors per 100,000. 41% of the total population of the third world has no access to safe drinking water. 1 in 7 children out of primary age is not in school. And the latest, the most important, I guess, for our purposes, statistics from the United Nations Development Program, and these are where these statistics come from. The external debt payments owed, debt payments supposed to be made in 1997 comprised 92% of the total production of the countries of the poorest countries. So there's a real crisis there, a crisis that is now exacerbated by the increase in the price of oil and the decrease in the price, the international price of the primary products which the poorest countries produce. And those debts, something has to be done about those debts because they make it impossible for any kind of social spending or more than a minimal social spending in the poorest third world countries. They're mainly in Africa, but there's some in Latin America, I know better, especially in Central America, plus Bolivia and Haiti. Non-governmental organizations, including Jubilee, which I'll describe, have focused on this as one of the major problems of the international financial system, and they focused on it in ways that brought the issue to the world's attention. Seattle, I guess, was the first time I heard about Jubilee 2000. It wasn't really widely publicized till the demonstrations in Seattle, although it has existed since 1996. but I've gone to the website and found this is the first paper I've ever written. It's largely based on website information. 4 sources: the Jubilee 2000 UK, so it's their organization, .org, and J2000USA.org, plus the IMF.org and the World Bank.org. And actually those 4 plus a few articles was all I needed. Well, all I needed was about this high. what I downloaded from the web. There's quite a lot of information there. So if you want to follow this up, it's very easy to do, and you don't need a major library. You just need a computer. Well, some of the figures that are used to describe the degree of the debt problem: per capita debt in Nicaragua is $2,000 per person. Per capita debt in Honduras is about $2,500 per person. Debt spending in most of these poorest countries is spending on debt repayment. That is the interest plus a certain part of the principal. In theory, at least, is about 3 times as large as spending on health and education. And then the figure that's most often cited by Jubilee 2000 and other organizations that are in this area is something drawn by a certain maybe fuzzy math from the United Nations Development Program report of 1997. With a little math and division and so on, they come out to 19,000 children a day die as a result of not having the kinds of social services which could be delivered if the debt payments were canceled. Essentially, so the push is for cancellation of debts of the poorest countries. There are 41 plus 2. It varies a little bit. 43 countries, most of them in Africa, 4 or 5 of them in Latin America. About which this is on which these measures and these pressures are focused. Well, how did they get into this mess? That this deeply indebted, and there you have a lot of different theories. The Catholic Relief Services, which has done a study on this, basically traces it to the commodity price problem, the increased price of oil and the lower price of commodities. There are others, it depends on your point of view. Others say, well, it was profligate spending by military dictators, corruption, economic inefficiency, especially state enterprises. That would be the Wall Street Journal version of this. And others will talk about the original debt problem, which emerged quite dramatically in Mexico in 1982, relating that directly to the OPEC price increases. But the critics from the third world and some from the religious organizations will say, well, part of it also was essentially peddling money, selling money. And I have a kind of case that I can cite from direct personal experience. My book on multinationals and nationalization was written in the 70s, and I did interviews in Latin America for the 4 or 5 case studies that I used, and one of them was Peru. And at one point I was sitting outside waiting to talk to the Assistant Minister of Finance about the whole question of compensation and so on for the Exxon subsidiary that they had nationalized, which was creating great problems for relations with the United States. And I looked around the waiting room there, and it was filled with young men in dark suits and white shirts, obviously with short haircuts, obviously Americans. And I started talking to them. It turned out they were selling money. They were representing the major New York banks, and they were trying to persuade the Peruvians to borrow to deal with the debt problems. And one of them told me, I said, this is really a way, I mean, we have, like regular salesmen, we will be rewarded for the loans that we persuade them to take. So, and this happened in a lot of places. Why were they under pressure on this? Because of the OPEC price increases. That is, the Middle Eastern oil producers had surplus oil, surplus money. They transferred it to New York and London and maybe Japan, I don't know, but New York and London mainly. And those banks had to recycle the money, to make it economically viable for them. They had to recycle the money to lend it out, as any bank wants to do. And the obvious place to look to lend are the people who were having problems paying their international debts. So actually, Peru was an interesting case because it was one of the first cases of. They borrowed a lot. And within 2 or 3 years, they were already in difficulty. And I remember I followed this because one of my former students was the IMF representative in Peru, and she was declared persona non grata and thrown out. And then, interestingly, in the 80s, it became a big issue in the country. And Alan Garcia, the president, a democratically elected president, after this, the 70s was the military, the 80s the civilians came in, and Alan Garcia announced that they were going to first have a moratorium on debt repayments and then have only a certain percentage of exports, a top 10% of export revenue, would go for debt repayments. Well, he was frozen out, Peru was frozen out of the international financial system. The inflation went crazy. At one point, inflation was 4,000%. And he was succeeded by the present president now, Fujimori, came in after that. And one of the first things he did was do what the international financial community told him to do. He ran on a populist program, so anti-foreign debt and so on. But once he got in, he went to New York and talked to the banks and talked to the IMF and introduced a stabilization program, which actually worked pretty well in his case. Most of these don't, but this one did, in bringing the inflation down. What is a stabilization program? It was cutting government spending. How? Partly privatization of state enterprises, but also cutting back on social services. And that kind of IMF formula for IMF/World Bank formula for stabilization it did work in some countries. Most countries it didn't. And what they did was keep bringing in teams who would then say, all right, you got to cut education, cut health, privatize your state enterprises, cut your bureaucracy and civil service by a third and so on. And if you want loans, and they had these structural adjustment loans, structural adjustment facility, you have to fulfill certain conditions. And the conditions got longer and longer, 106 conditions for, Santa Tome? This was criticized recently. But I guess the case that sort of illustrated the problem was Indonesia, when the Asian crisis in the 90s came in, and they came in with a lot of conditions and to stabilize the economy, and it only made things worse. It increased unemployment, increased inflation, and even the former chief economist for the World Bank, Joe Stiglitz, who used to teach at Princeton, wrote an article in the New Republic saying this is the wrong way to go. And so it was becoming increasingly apparent that, at least in the case of the poorest countries, they would never be able to pay their debts. The debt service and amortization had gone up so far, and the likelihood that they could fulfill 106 conditions was so low that there really was a crisis by the mid-90s. In the 80s, it looked as if there was going to be a crisis, and at one point Fidel Castro called a meeting of all the Latin American countries to call a moratorium on, actually to denounce the international debts. Those countries did not follow him on that, and it's interesting why they didn't. Because the problem is you need then, in terms of the international system, to at least sort of stay in the system in order to get new loans. And what did you use the new loans for? To pay at least symbolic payments on the old loans. And that was the way that the debt crisis which we heard a lot about in the early 80s, notably in the case of Mexico, but all over Latin America. That's the way it was ultimately resolved. That is, there were some of the IMF reforms, and there was sort of rollover and postponement. And the theory of, it wasn't the IMF and World Bank were not just trying to make people suffer. The theory was that you get a more efficient kind of efficient economy. You invite foreign investment in, and the loans then can be repaid. I mean, the whole theory of international lending is it's supposed to be for productive investment, not for corruption. We're borrowing. The business borrows from a bank in this country. The idea is that makes it be able to create a source of wealth which can both repay the loan and make the economy grow. That was the theory, and to some degree it worked in Latin America. Not all countries, especially not in Bolivia or Haiti or the Central American countries, and they're on this list now of places that are in trouble. So in the middle 90s, you then have the recognition that there is a real crisis, and the crisis is getting worse, not better, and that there are countries that do not have the capacity to either engage in the reforms or to attract foreign investment or to pay. Although they go through the motions, they do token payment, part of the interest, part of the amortization, so as to stay in the system in order specifically to get access to new loans which they can use for this kind of charade that's going on. Now, this then comes to the attention in the middle 90s of religious groups. And there was already a kind of working group of religious groups in Washington that were concerned about third world debt, but they meet together in 96 and 97, and the world is really basically both the top and the bottom. That is, the Vatican is very interested in this, and indeed at one point the IMF has a secret director who was a Catholic at that point, French Catholic, who had a secret meeting with the Vatican people at Seton Hall that was not reported, just except for rumors. The World Council of Churches took this up as a major concern, a new slavery, a debt slavery, and it was linked to the approach of the Jubilee year in 2000. So this is 3 and 4 years before, and organizations get started, United States, UK, Italy, partly with Vatican support, Germany, and Western Europe generally, the Philippines, and Korea. And what is the link to the Jubilee? Well, the link is Leviticus 25, which proclaims the Jubilee year as the year in which debts will be forgiven, slaves will be free, and land will go back to its original owners. Now, how often this ever happened, I think probably never. But because it would have, there'd no longer be any kind of transfer of property or loans. You'd have leases. I mean, that essentially would call for 50-year leases. It would propose to sort of transform the economy completely to a 50-year lease, and loans would have to only last for 50 years maximum. But it was there in Leviticus 25. And it was linked to slavery by the World Council of Churches, linked it to the debt. And then, interestingly, one of the things they did was use the King James version of the Our Father. So forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. So we must forgive us our debts became the kind of rallying cry of the World Council of Churches. And they also cited other passages, the famous passage in Isaiah 61 that Jesus read in the synagogue in Nazareth about liberation of the oppressed. That is one of the key proof texts for liberation theology. And the Jubilee year then was then to be used to focus on this issue. The Jubilee, as you know, was started in Catholicism by Pope Boniface VIII in 1300, and it was occasion for pilgrimages, as it is today, for pilgrimages to Rome and visits to the holy places, and it has been repeated 50 and 25 years ever since, except in the 19th century for political reasons didn't take place. But the link, the focus, placing the primary focus on debt forgiveness was new. Jubilee 2000 has an office in Washington and claims 50 or 60 organizational affiliates in this country. The British organization claims 70. They're mostly religious, but some, Oxfam, for instance, a well-known international relief agency, is one, and some of the environmental agencies as well. The United States Catholic Conference took it up and prepared a kit, which you can send for. I have the address. Well, it's just USCC, basically. You can send for a kit on the world debt and debt forgiveness. And I think Sidney Callahan mentioned to me that her parish had got a copy of this as a use for their social action committee. And they coordinated they wrote papers, did grassroots organizing, and put pressure on governments, on legislatures, financial and banking groups. And the rhetoric, looking through it, you see the rhetoric starts out, immediate, total, unconditional debt forgiveness. Well, of course, for the third world. Well, Mexico owes $100 billion. Brazil owes $150 billion. You forgive that, and the entire international financial system collapses. And human needs are even in worse shape than they are dealing with problems of basic human needs would not be helped by a collapse of the world economy. But basically what they did was focus on the issue of human need and saying that has to take priority over the IMF fueled argument that the solution to the problem is to be able to increase exports and earn foreign exchange. And they focused also on these conditions and said you need conditions to make sure it does help the poor, but that's those are the ones, not conditions like the IMF saying, cash crops for exports because you got to earn foreign exchange. And then they also, interestingly, and that came up, of course, in Seattle and since, called for, the buzzword is transparency, for openness of decision-making in the international financial institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, the Inter-American Development Bank and the African Development Bank, and even a sort of democratizing of the whole process of debt forgiveness through some kind of body related to the UN. And maybe a bankruptcy court, an insolvency tribunal is what they called it, to preside over a more orderly process of debt forgiveness. And the Jubilee people became most visible at Seattle, but they already were active. Essentially what they do is target the international meetings, not just IMF and World Bank, but that's one. That was true in Prague last month. Actually, in September, they organized a funeral procession for the 19,000 children that died as a result of the lack of action on debt forgiveness. In Prague, they had a funeral procession which ended up at the cathedral with prayers on this subject. But they had been doing things like this not only at IMF and World Bank meetings, but also at the meetings of the G7/8, the large lenders who meet every 6 months or every year. And interestingly, they will meet next in Genoa in May of 2001, and it's pretty clear they're going to be that the Jubilee 2001, I guess it'll be at that point, will be targeting that meeting as well. And similarly, of course, the Seattle was not a meeting of either of these organizations, but was of the World Trade Organization. So at each of these organizational meetings, people from Jubilee 2000 came. And because of that pressure, and because of the problem that you had to deal with, there began to be a significant international response and domestic response in the U.S. I heard James Baker at his reunion at Princeton talk about this, and last May, and then last week I heard President Clinton talk about it at Princeton again. And in both cases they said, yes, we must do something about the poorest of the poor, the poorest countries, but we have to make sure that it is linked to, focused directly on poverty alleviation, that it doesn't get wasted, and that they create the institutions which can do this. This was another example, actually, of a discussion of this, which was publicized somewhat, was President Clinton's talk at a prayer breakfast last month in Washington, again on the same subject, but where again he emphasized that the debtor companies had to establish a system and a track record, he emphasized that assured that the money saved would be targeted to poverty alleviation. Now, the Jubilee 2000 people not only were pressing for these changes, they were also doing analysis. They did analysis of the capacities of the IMF, for instance, and World Bank to forgive debts, where they could get in terms of selling gold and their reserves, and how much it would actually cost, because the actual cost is less than the theoretical cost, because in fact, starting in the 80s, in Latin America, you have a secondary market in debt instruments, and so where you can buy these debt instruments internationally, but in the case, for instance, of Nicaragua, which has $6 billion worth of debt for 3 million people, the debt instruments are worth 8 cents on the dollar. So actually you can pay off some of these debts, a lot of these debts, with much less than the face value, especially in the case of the private lender, or both. The other thing that Jubilee did was go into the history of debt forgiveness, and it turns out there's a long history that the bonds of the southern states before the Civil War were still in the system into the 20th century. The German reparations debts were renegotiated in the 1920s, and Hitler reputed them in 1934, but they weren't actually finally settled until 1952, and they were settled at 10 cents on the dollar. And linked, as Alan Garcia did not succeed in doing in Peru, linked to foreign exchange, for export capacity, so with a kind of top on how much you had to pay off depending on your exports. The United States wrote off much of Mexican debts and got a kind of 10 cents on the dollar compensation for the oil companies that were nationalized there in 1938 during World War II, because they wanted to get Mexico, and make sure that Mexico would cooperate in the war effort, and that was part of that effort. When Sukarno was overthrown in 1965 in Indonesia, and hundreds of thousands of people were killed, we rushed in and forgave much of Indonesia's debt. And the one that I had never heard about until I did this research is that something like $10 billion of the Egyptian debt was forgiven in 1990 in return for their cooperation in the Gulf War. So this is not the first time that debt forgiveness has been carried out for higher policy purposes. The international institutions then responded to this pressure starting in 1996, and that gave a kind of interesting kind of counterpart to Jubilee. I mean, people they could both negotiate with and pressure, by the creation of a special facility for HIPCs. And HIPCs are highly indebted poor countries, HIPC. So HIPCs became the buzzword. If you talk to anybody in the IMF or the World Bank about the problem of debt forgiveness, you start using the term HIPC fairly quickly. So what they did was make a list in 1996 of 41, later expanded to 43, HIPCs, and they were eligible for partial debt write-off. There was never any talk about total debt forgiveness, although that's what Jubilee was pushing for. And a lot of emphasis was placed on their demonstrating a capacity to channel those resources to the alleviation of poverty. So what they had to do was both show they could increase exports so that they could pay off the reduced debt, that they had structures which would immediately or as soon as possible reflect the reduction in the debt burden through improvements in health, education, AIDS, etc. programs. And the one example that I read in my research was that the Ugandans, as part of, and they were one of the first ones to respond on this, as part of their program, eliminated school fees. Previously, a lot of people couldn't go to the public schools because you had to pay money, and that was part of the demonstration that they had a program for a strategy, as always called, poverty alleviation strategy programs that they had set up, and originally you had to do this over 6 years. In other words, they promised you debt relief, but they had to it was held back, but it was very slow in coming, and that's one of the criticisms that Jubilee makes. But at the end of 6 years, later reduced partly because of international pressure to 3 years, you get certified that you're eligible for this finally, not on an interim basis, but finally with something called the completion point. And Uganda has reached that point, and Bolivia, and some others are supposed to this fall. In 1999, the international financial institutions and the G7 countries modified these terms, again under pressure, and talked about an enhanced HIPC poverty alleviation program. And in fact, the structural adjustment loan program, which has gotten so much criticism in Indonesia, was then renamed Poverty Alleviation and Sustainable Growth Facility. But it's doing the same thing, but this is a kind of public relations. But in fact, a response, and you may have seen the New York Times had an article about this a couple of months ago, about the sort of World Bank and IMF as a moving target. That is, that they respond to this pressure that Wolfensohn has said, oh yes, there's a real problem, and tell us what we can do, and sort of bringing in 40 or 50 people from the NGOs into the World Bank and actually hiring them to assist with the development of some of these enhanced programs, cutting back this probation period from 6 to 3, lowering the conditions on percentage of exports that had to be available for debt repayment and interest due, and interim payments. I mean, the criticism was we do all these measures, we have to wait 6 years or 3 years. Now they have interim payments for interim adjustments, interim reductions in the debt, and interim certifications that they are. So there's a process of kind of bargaining and, a lot of oversight, but an interaction between the highly indebted countries and the international financial institutions. Jubilee 2000 has found this very unsatisfactory, has continually publicized the lack of progress in granting debt relief and the imposition of so many conditions. They've called for the creation of a UN body to review the debt problem and make recommendations. And there was a commission, actually a Meltzer commission early this year, that came out in favor of full debt relief. But the HIPC facilities continue to go where they're follow the 1999 policies, and 10 countries have now received sort of provisional debt relief out of the 43, although only one has reached the completion point where the debts are irrevocably canceled. The debts not being the whole debt, but usually about a third of the debts. So their commitment now to cancel about 16 billion out of 50 or 100, I've seen both figures, that is owed. And they also used an argument, I think a fallacious argument, that more money has gone to that the poor countries are subsidizing the World Bank and the IMF because more money has flowed in debt repayments than they've gotten in new loans in the last several years. Well, that, of course, relates to a large amount of past debts, and when you pay interest, I mean, your bank is making money from your mortgage, and you pay them back much more than you get from them. And what they do is compare the current disbursements with the old debt interest requirements, so that, but what that does illustrate is that while there has been substantial debt payment reduction on the books, it hasn't been enough to relieve what is a huge burden, and that process of sort of in getting new debt to pay old debts is not working very well. This has also been reflected in the U.S. Congress. There is, I think, quite small amounts are in the budget for involvement in debt forgiveness, $235 million for this year and $215 for next, or the other way around. It was passed by the House of Representatives in July, part of it was, but has been postponed indefinitely in the Senate. And I just didn't have time to call before I left where that is. You know, there's this final rush now but I suspect it's getting lost in the. But keep an eye on this. The Jubilee people now have Kofi Annan on their side, and he's written to the G8 countries and said, made a kind of list of further changes that this was just last month that need to be made. Eligibility requirements lowered. Debts pegged to the percentage of foreign export earnings, which is not part of the present program. That is a top on the debt repayments. He wants debt cancellation for developing countries that suffer natural disasters. He's thinking of the floods in Mozambique, for instance, that you just cancel their debts because they just have this huge burden of flood relief. And the New York Times has come on board twice with editorials calling for debt forgiveness, complete debt forgiveness. And I mentioned the Sonny Bono, not Sonny Bono, he's dead, but Bono of U2, and his efforts to get people together. So this is a fascinating example of something that I had one question to Alistair McIntyre about compartmentalization and choice and his talk, that isn't there also this other process of where people are making links to each other that didn't before, that through the internet, among other things, and through the worldwide religious organizations, the World Council of Churches and the Catholic Church, and Oxfam and other environmental organizations, you've now got a really powerful pressure group, especially since it's linked to local parishes and local organizations. And they have this strong argument that here are people dying of AIDS and nothing can be done for them in Africa because of the burden of debt service. The progress has been slow so far, and the big debate right now is the partial rather than full debt forgiveness. In other words, they want to keep the system in place, even though you give partial, a third debt relief is roughly what they're doing these days, although more in cases like Mozambique. I think it's the last proposal was 70% of their debt would be forgiven. There's also a debate. People say, well, wait a minute, why should you reward the inefficient and profligate regimes, or often corrupt regimes in the past, whereas the countries that have done a good job of don't get this kind of beneficence. The question now is, where does Jubilee 2000 go after the year 2000 is over? It has a high-quality publicity and research operation, and it is a useful counterbalance to the self-congratulatory publicity of the international financial institutions. I assume that they're going to maybe rename it, but continue. Now that you have these organizations, continue after the end of the current year, although there has been at least one article saying, well, the pressure is going to be off once the Jubilee year is over. And in terms of attitudes that one should take to this, it seems to me, well, for one response would be to, well, put it this way, that I think it's an interesting example of a kind of change in the case of Catholicism, in the sort of critique of the international system, which has been, I mean, part of what happened in Centesimus was moving away from a kind of anti-capitalist rhetoric that had been part of the Catholic tradition, really, since the Middle Ages, and accepting the importance of the market and of the international and of globalization as a creator of wealth which can be beneficial to the poorest of the poor, but also recognizing, and as the Pope did in 1991, that you've got to have institutions doing something about this. You can't simply leave this to the market. And it seems to me the standard that Christians need to take is one that my colleague Richard Falk has been emphasizing for many years, the whole question of unnecessary suffering, relief of unnecessary suffering. How can one, without destroying the international financial system and without sort of giving away everything to corrupt governments, how can one make use of the prosperity that the international global capitalist system produces, but produces in a very skewed way? How can one make the fruits of that available to the poorest of the poor? And I think this is a continuing concern, and one that all of us maybe can participate in, as in fact the parishes that have gotten the kits from the USCC have done. So I invite your questions about this and continuing discussion.
Okay, a reminder, please use the microphones to ask your questions, and if you would, identify yourself.
I'm Pat Reardon from Touchstone Magazine. I have the same question about the Jubilee 2000 that I have about Ralph Nader. Where do they get their funding?
Well, in a lot of cases, it's the member organizations. I mean, when you have 60 organizations, they contribute. I mean, Oxfam gets its funding from international from donors, but the World Council of Churches, there's some debate on the part, but they in effect tax the national councils of churches. So they are. See, this is an organization of organizations, and those organizations, in turn, as far as I can determine, contribute to this movement. Mm-hmm.
Hi, I'm Phil Devine from Providence College. I have a theoretical question with some practical implications. The question has to do with the relationship between religion and politics. Mm-hmm. The religious base of Jubilee 2000 is highly rhetorical. I mean, there's nothing approaching the ancient Israelite institution, which may never have happened, really being proposed. I mean, its rhetoric is being drawn from this to a very different situation. This is not bad, this is good, but it leads to a problem. How do you carry this through when the needed prudential decisions have to be made? And particularly, how do you deal with the problem of possible hijack by secular ideologies that may be deeply hostile to Christianity or other traditional religions? I mean, relief of unnecessary suffering is a slogan that could be used by Peter Singer, who is explicitly anti-Christian, both in theory and in practice.
Well, I think part of it is the people that make up this coalition. These are religious orders. A lot of the nuns, orders of nuns, are members of Jubilee 2000, and they, have, in fact, the Jubilee has a list of the things that they've done in the way of debt forgiveness and so on. So I think it's a question of, since this is really basically a couple of people at the center, but presumably subject to the 60 membership organizations, member organizations, and if they're going astray, they can simply leave. They can vote with their feet. On the Singer question, someone came up to me afterwards and said, when I first spoke, the second time I spoke, the first time I identified myself as a professor at Princeton, and he said, I associate Princeton with only one thing, the appointment by the Center for Human Values of Peter Singer. And I think maybe you'd be interested in, I guess, my take on this. I was not involved in the appointment because it wasn't done in my department. It was done in the Center for Human Values that Lawrence Rockefeller basically funds. But it was done through the normal procedures of with which I've been involved for many years. I'm on 3 committees right now that are doing searches. And so what the search committees do is make a list of all the best people in the world in a given subject, both from their own knowledge and from consultation with others around the country in the field. And that's what they did in the Singer case, and the name Singer kept coming up again and again. The second concern, of course, is, are they movable? It's that he was out in Australia and was known, I think, as much, if not more, for his positions on animal rights. That was his first sort of international kind of argument that got a lot of attention, as he was for the rather brutal, cruel application of a straight pleasure-paying calculus. He came to Princeton with a great deal of fanfare, as you know. Not Dead Yet came and chained their wheelchairs to Nassau Hall, and I've spent some time with him. He's a quite reasonable person. He is wrong, but I think in some ways it has stimulated a great deal of discussion about morals on the Princeton campus, and in fact has had a kind of counter effect in the sense that the limitations of utilitarianism are dramatically demonstrated with the way he carries it to 28 days or whatever, or until a person becomes rational and such. And the students now, we've had one great big meeting with about 500 students with a handicapped woman from Wellesley debating him on these issues, and he has a course in which he invites opponents to criticize him. And I could just say, because I teach political theory, which is related, and I do sense, I just sang this last week, I do sense a kind of reaction against utilitarianism. That is, people are now much more aware of why the simple sort of pleasure-pain, Benthamite version, at least, of utilitarianism is wrong. And that's because Singer is on the campus and stimulating people to think critically about what he represents. Now, if I had been on the committee, I wouldn't have chosen him, but I don't think it's all bad, by any means, to have him present on the campus. Further questions?
I'm Helen Alvarez. I'm with the law school at Catholic University. I just recently came from working at USCC, and I know there's
tell us more about that.
Well, very general enthusiasm for that. It's one of the few things that I saw crop up and become widely known at the conference and widely supported. It was there's so much that we work on in the area of poverty domestically that people are aware of, where we feel that the progress is so painfully slow. Mm-hmm. And this debt forgiveness, as you suggested, took on wonderful public relations talent and really became widely known and widely supported. Mm-hmm. So I just think it was wonderful. The USCC is very enthusiastic about it. Mm-hmm. I actually had 2 questions for you. One was your evaluation of the attempt to set up a relationship between cancellation of debt and use of the funds freed up for poverty, whether that can be done. And the second is just a practical question that occurred to me, and again, your presentation was extremely useful. The practical question that arose as to how it is that the international financial markets could never forgive all at once and immediately all the debt without collapse, but how they're managing to do maybe a third over X number of years. And is it because of prosperity that we're seeing in the global markets? Could they do more than one-third?
Yes, I think they could do more. I think they're able to do it because, in fact, as I said, in some cases these are discounted debt instruments. I approve of the link between poverty alleviation and the creation of institutions for that purpose and debt forgiveness. But I think the problem has been that it's been very slow and bureaucratic, and the 3 years. I mean, to wait 6 years for this is just too long. And so I just think it has to be sped up. And in fact, if you look at the New York Times last month, there was an article about the meeting in Prague, in which talked about they've now promised to have 10 more countries getting the final completion point within the next month, and by the end of the year they'll have a kind of interim. So, but I think it's related to the continuing pressure and publicity. So that now the problem of which I alluded to when I talked about the debt problem in Latin America in the 80s. The problem with too much debt cancellation is nobody will go near the country with money except official money, on special kinds of poverty alleviation funds from the World Bank or the IMF. And the IMF is in that, for the first time into the poverty alleviation business. But I think the long-range goal is to make the private sector get back in, and that has happened. I mean, there have been, as I mentioned, there have been debt cancellations and repudiations in the past, and when they get their act together, Peru, as an example, Peru became a country which a lot of people were interested in investing in the mid-'90s. Nobody would touch it in the mid-'80s. So it can be done, but you look at the case of Haiti, who wants to invest in Haiti? People have invested. Baseballs are made there and a couple of other things, but it is a kind of complicated game, really, of both trying to make more money available and resources available for poverty alleviation and make the country more creditworthy at the same time, and that's what the game they're playing. Who's next?
Thank you, Bill. David Burrell from Notre Dame. Paul, we know that this has to be shown to work. And so I want to ask about the WTO's place in it for the following reason, that funds that are liberated from paying off debt, interest and principal can also be put into the World Trade thing, and that's a very important part. And when Cardinal Evarista Arns started mentioning this in the middle 80s, a number of economists came on board saying, look, if we want trade between North and South America, those funds can go into trade rather than into debt. That's the first part of the question. And this is important because if you think of someone like Susan George, for example, Fate Worse Than Debt, and her shift in rhetoric to her latest book, the Lugano Report, it was a shift in rhetoric from what we should do to what we must do to keep the whole system going. So there's a sense in which debt forgiveness, good economists, that is economists who know how to think, creatively, could show that debt forgiveness is actually going to increase the capacity for trade and interaction. And they could also remind you that debts have probably been paid a couple times over anyway. But what I'm saying, how about this side of it? They might say the creative economic side of it.
Yeah, I think that that is part of the argument that's used to persuade Wall Street, for instance, that this is a good idea. The way they are now, they're never going to be able to pay the debts. So you've got to forgive them, all or part of them, so they can make a new start and reorganize their economy in a way that will enable it to be a productive member of the international trading system. Now, what was the Lugano report?
All this stuff is still we should.
Yeah.
Now it goes over preserving capitalism in the 21st century, what we must do.
Yeah.
And attend to the environment and all sorts of issues like that actually become, it's putting at external things and making them more internal.
Yeah, it's interesting that you're getting a sort of shift here from the sort of Nader hand-wringing to this is a practical program for the redesign of the international system in a way that it'll be productive and help everybody. And that way you get the right on board, and that's why you get Baker and people like that saying, this is an important initiative and focusing on it.
Bill Murphy, I'm here at Notre Dame. I'm interested in the connections between this debt forgiveness and the culture of debt, which is our topic here. And I'm wondering about the influence of some of the ideologies that show up in some of the UN conferences, say Beijing, Cairo, regarding population control. And whether those influences are attached to the conditions for debt forgiveness. I mean, are we...
That's an interesting question. I don't know whether the population policy is one of the 106 conditions. Mm-hmm. I suspect it's not because of, the international
I hope not.
sensitivity of it. Yeah.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point.
Yeah, Ralph McInerney. This is a question from someone infinitely less wise. I don't understand the mechanics of debt reduction. And what I fear is it sounds like a way of bailing out banks. That is, you mentioned that there were bills in Congress to set aside so much tax money for debt reduction. Now, what are we doing? Are we just sort of guaranteeing or ensuring bad loans on the part of international?
No, everybody takes a hit. They actually get less, but they're more likely to get it. So the idea, this was again done. I'm familiar with what was done in the case of Latin America in the 80s. You had the Baker Plan and a couple of other plans that were basically the banks took exchanged bonds for got bonds instead of loan funds, but reduced amount, but more likelihood of their being paid off. So they take some. They're paid less, but it's more likely to be paid. That's the kind of game that is played there. So you use this to guarantee, for instance, the reduced payments are then guaranteed by some kind of international facility that they will be paid. So it benefits them in one sense. In another sense, they get less in the way of payoff than they would have if, which wasn't going to happen anyway, they were paid off at face value.
David Castaldi. The first a comment and then a question. I thought you might have referred to the presidential debate this week in which Governor Bush proposed third world debt forgiveness.
I didn't see it, so I missed that.
In response to one of Jim Lair's questions. The question is, how much third world debt are we talking about in total? When you spoke about debt forgiveness plan of 16 million out of 50 million for billion out for 40 countries, that didn't include the Mexicos and the Brazils of the world, which you had previously referred to as $250 billion.
Right.
How much total third world debt are we talking about?
Well, I have it's the 41 countries like Uganda, Mauritania, Bolivia, Mozambique, Honduras, Senegal, Nicaragua. So they're generally small countries. They're generally poor countries. And the debt, for instance, I have a Jubilee report on this. The total debt of all of these countries is 43 billion nominal, but 27 billion net present value. So that's part of that discounting process. And the proposals for reduction that are going through are at 9 billion now. So it's not big money in a way.
So is that what Jubilee?
A billion here and a billion there, yeah.
As Everett Dirksen said,
right.
It eventually adds up. Is that what Jubilee 2000 is proposing?
No, they're proposing total forgiveness.
Including the Mexico?
Oh, no. Total forgiveness of the HIPICs.
Just
Just the 41 or 43 countries. No. So they're basically saying 27 billion we can do. 43 may be hard, but 27 we can. And they have a report on this and showing where the money could come from and how it isn't necessary to go through all this. Now, the response would be, but then you don't have this business of making them focus on reducing school fees and increasing health, there's good conditionality and bad conditionality, and the Indonesian conditions were bad, but conditions that make sure this doesn't go to the bureaucracy but goes directly to the poor, I think, should be linked here, and the idea of sort of making them create these institutions and so on. It's just that it has been such a slow bureaucratic process that Jubilee is, keeps pushing on it as they should, saying speed it up, and they have now started to speed it up. But it is feasible, and that's why I guess George W. Bush can support it, because it can be done without bankrupting the system. Now, Mexico, Brazil, and so on, they're out of it completely, and there is some talk about reducing the burden on the so-called middle income countries, which Mexico and Brazil are examples, but you're in big numbers, as you said.
David Denz from St. Myron. Referring back to the Bush debate the other night, Bush also said that or seemed to imply that he was against the concept of the United States as nation building.
Yeah.
And I'm very interested in the link between these kinds of movements and nation building. It seems to me it's nation building through the back door, through the economic system. So what is the political side of this? Are we...
Well, theoretically, it's nobody here but us economists. But in fact, as we saw in Russia and lots of places, it has very deep political implications.
Well, I'm curious. Does that mean we would have interest, say, in destabilizing certain kinds of economic regimes? Are we pushing for democracy in these countries?
American policy is committed, since Carter, has been committed to democracy as one of our goals. On the other hand, sometimes, we're not pushing very hard for Saudi Arabia to get democratic. So it depends. But clearly it does have an economic implication. In a way, it relates to the old business that I was involved in the 60s with the Alliance for Progress, the creation of a middle class. And that in turn is seen as, making it possible for educated democratic politics to emerge.
Just one other little side point. Many of these countries are in Africa, and
right.
The cases that you cited, in some of the cases of previous debt relief, there have been kind of negotiables. That is, we could gain something by debt relief.
Mm-hmm.
I think the problem for Africa is that, if I may put it bluntly, the international community is simply not interested in Africa. That is very much the impression you get in the news, that we have no stake there, and that however it goes is however it goes. And I'm wondering where the incentives for a serious concern with Africa.
Religious organizations and environmental organizations and relief organizations. This coalition I talked about is, I think, beginning to fill that gap, which
follow up the question about the total cost of relieving the debt.
Mm-hmm.
How does the figure of $27 billion that you cited compare with the cost of the S&L bailout?
Ooh. I assume I don't know. Who knows what was the figure? Yeah.
It cost more to bail out the S&Ls than it cost to fight the Second World War.
Yeah. Okay.
Considerably more than it would cost to forgive the debts of the Hippies.
Absolutely. Good point.
My name is Tika, and I'm from Bethel College. This might be really ignorant to ask, but how is $100 billion in debt different than the $3 trillion in debt that we are as the United States? Is that a trade deficit that's different than that's different? Is that very different than the, Mexico's debt or whatnot? And my following question then, why I want to know that is because I'm just wondering, how do we know that this is a major key to potential, because we function so well with such a great debt? And I'm wondering...
Well, we function well with our debt because we are creditworthy. That is, people will want to buy U.S. bonds and debt instruments because it is a sound and expanding economy. And this is not true of Africa. So that's a very important difference. And then, of course, some of our debt is internal. Some of theirs is too, but they don't have much. They have no really internal financial system, which can provide the kind of resources they need. So they're very dependent on external debt, and they're not capable of servicing that debt. That's the difference. Mm-hmm.
All right, this is our last question.
Saved it to last. My name is John Campbell. I'm just a private citizen. I was the person he referred to in
the Singer case.
The Singer case, right. It's interesting that you used, as a college professor, you used the politically incorrect word wrong, but I think it was very correct in this particular case.
Absolutely.
I appreciate the use of that term. I'm doing some work in Malawi, Africa, as I shared with you when we talked. And I've come into contact with many very, very good, honest NGOs. We had a question earlier regarding the possibility of funds being hijacked. And I believe that there are NGOs out in the African community in many countries that could help avoid the misappropriation of funds. Is there anything being done that you're aware of to put into the structure of the auditing and the use of funds the active participation of NGOs?
The only thing I know about that is this effort by Wolfenson, the head of the World Bank, to involve the NGOs in the whole process, and I assume part of that could. Now, auditing, part of the reason the process is so slow is that you've got so much auditing. You've got constantly having to make reports every 10 minutes practically, and auditing is not a problem because they've had bad experiences in the past. So there really is, I think, already a structure in place on this in terms of accounting for the funds, which is not to say that, hijacking doesn't take place at various times. But on the whole, the international financial institutions have a long track record on this, and they would not be able to get the support from the countries unless they had that. But the NGOs, I know there is, I guess the only case I know in Latin America is the Haiti, the NGOs are quite closely involved with sort of the official, unofficial relief organizations work very closely together. And then Catholic Relief Services, of course, has a worldwide organization that can report on what's happening on the grassroots, because you've got a structure there at the grassroots. So I agree. I think the cooperation between the NGOs and the lenders, the official lenders particularly, is very useful.
Wonderful. I'd like to remind you that in 15 minutes we'll reconvene, and there will be two panels, one on Catholic feminism and the culture of death, which will be here, and another on bioethical dilemmas, stem cell research, which is rooms 210 to 214 upstairs. So thank you all.